I gave them Golan Heights. I gave them the Abraham Accords. I recognized the capital of Israel and opened the embassy in Jerusalem. Gave them billions and billions of dollars. I was the best friend Israel ever had.
Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
He doesn't want to do it. He's become like a Palestinian, but they don't like him because he's a very bad Palestinian. He's a weak one.
I think that it is, without any question, our imperative to do what we can to allow Israel to defend itself.
The answer should have been hit the nuclear first and worry about the rest later.
The expansion of Israel and its proxies is an absolute fundamental necessity for the United States.
The expansion of Israel and its proxies is an absolute fundamental necessity for the United States.
It is up to Israel what they think they need to do to keep their country safe, and we should support our allies wherever they are when they're fighting the bad guys.
I have my entire career and life supported Israel.
I've often said, Mr. President, if there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one.
She hates Israel. If she's president, I believe that Israel will not exist within 2 years from now.
But the one thing I will assure you always, I will always give Israel the ability to defend itself.
Donald Trump recognized that for people to fear the United States, you needed peace through strength. People were afraid of stepping out of line.
For people to fear the United States.
Long said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
And we will deport the foreign jihad sympathizers and Hamas supporters from our midst. We will get them out. If you hate America, if you want to eliminate Israel, we will throw you out of our country so rapidly your head will spin.
The United States and Israel are waging war across the Middle East. They have both been attacking about half of the countries in the region. Israel has been brutally bombing Gaza and the occupied West Bank, which is Palestinian territory, for a year using U.S. weapons. Israel has also been attacking Iran, Syria, and Yemen. Likewise, the United States has repeatedly launched airstrikes against Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. And of course, the U.S. is supporting Israel as it has attacked Iran and Palestine. Now, what's important to stress about these wars is how completely bipartisan they are in Washington. The leaders of both the Democratic and Republican parties have openly expressed support for these U.S.-Israeli wars and have called for providing more and more weapons to Israel to help it carry out more war crimes and crimes against humanity. Because that's what Israel has been officially accused of by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, which are investigating Israel and Israeli officials on charges of crimes against humanity and even genocide. Today, I'm going to be looking at some of the statements made by top U.S. officials expressing staunch support for Israel, and I'll also be fact-checking them and showing how wrong some of them are. And I'm going to be looking at statements made by Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and Kamala Harris, and also their running mates, J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. But before I show clips from them, I want to briefly provide some more context. That's very important. The International Court of Justice, which is the top United Nations legal authority, issued a ruling in January saying very clearly that Israel can be investigated on charges of genocide in a case that was introduced by South Africa, which of course was a victim of apartheid, just like the people of Palestine are victims of apartheid today. And Israel blatantly violated this ruling made by the Hague, and even mainstream human rights organizations in the West have said that Israel is violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention. Top experts at the United Nations have said very clearly that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people, and these UN legal experts called for an arms embargo on Israel. However, the US government has been blatantly defying these legal experts, and the US government, the Biden administration, has continued sending billions and billions of dollars of weapons and ammunition and other military aid to Israel. In just 1 year, the Biden administration sent more than $18 billion of military assistance to Israel. And Israel has constantly, on a daily basis, used those US weapons to bomb civilian areas, killing tens of thousands of civilians. For instance, this October 2024, Israel bombed a mosque and school that were being used in Gaza to house civilians who lost their homes because Israel bombed and destroyed their homes. Dozens of Palestinians were killed in this attack, and even CNN admitted in a report that a US bomb was used by Israel in order to massacre these Palestinian civilians who were in a shelter. And there are literally thousands more Israeli attacks like this on civilian areas in Gaza, which are intentional. In fact, journalists at Dropsite News, which was founded by veterans of The Intercept, they published an incredible report citing Israeli officials who revealed that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has sat in on meetings with top Israeli officials and has given a green light to attack civilian targets in Gaza, including the U.S. Secretary of State told Israeli officials that they can bomb humanitarian aid trucks intentionally, on purpose. This is not an accident. This is Israeli regime policy backed by the United States, giving them the green light. And this is why the civilian death toll in Gaza has been so extremely high. In fact, in October 2024, 99 American doctors, surgeons, and medical professionals who have served in Gaza treating civilians in the past year, they published an open letter to U.S. President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. And in this letter, they estimated that the death toll in Gaza in the first year of this brutal U.S.-backed Israeli bombing is greater than 118,000 Palestinians killed out of a population of roughly 2 million. They estimate that about 5% of Gaza's population has been exterminated by Israel in this U.S.-backed genocide. And this was also the conclusion that scientific experts came to in a peer-reviewed article that they published in the leading scientific journal, The Lancet. They noted that in previous wars, there were roughly 4 indirect deaths for every death. That is, the people who are directly killed by bombing are a small minority of the overall casualties. A lot of other people die because of disease, because of hunger, because of no medical attention, because the hospitals have been bombed and destroyed by Israel using U.S. bombs. So given this previous record, and given the death toll as of July, when this article was published, they estimated that in Gaza, in a conservative estimate, 186,000 Palestinians would die, and that was roughly 8% of Gaza's population. But that conservative estimate was based at the time on the current official death toll from the Gaza Health Ministry of around 38,000 deaths. Since then, that number has increased by several thousand. So if you did the same calculation, including indirect deaths, it's very likely that more than 200,000 Gazans will lose their lives in this genocide, which is more than 10% of the entire population of the Gaza Strip. And by the way, I should point out, because some pro-Israel propagandists sometimes claim that the Gaza Health Ministry's death toll figures cannot be trusted, but in reality, the Israeli intelligence agencies themselves use the Gazan Health Ministry's figures because they know that historically they have been accurate. The United Nations also uses the Gaza Health Ministry figures. They have a long history in previous wars of not only being accurate, but actually of being conservative, being an undercount of the total number of Palestinians killed by Israel in these previous horrific wars on Gaza. This is why in May, the International Criminal Court at The Hague officially applied for arrest warrants against Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The ICC officially accused them of crimes against humanity, starvation of civilians as a war crime, and extermination of the Palestinian people. However, those arrest warrants were not officially issued because of threats and blackmail and pressure by Western governments, including by the US government, which ironically is not even a member of the International Criminal Court. But top US officials from both the Democratic and Republican parties have threatened the ICC and ICC staff, and even the US has threatened family members of ICC prosecutors and attorneys. So this is what the West calls its rules-based order, threatening international legal institutions to make sure that Israeli officials are not held accountable for carrying out genocide and crimes against humanity with the full support of the United States and most Western governments. And in fact, instead of stopping Israel's genocide in Palestine, the US and Western governments have strongly supported Israel as it has expanded its war across the region, invading Lebanon and also bombing Syria, Yemen, and Iran. And what are Israel's goals? Well, it's very obvious. Colonialism, territorial expansion, colonizing the land of its neighbors. Far-right Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made this quite clear when he gave a speech at the United Nations, and he brought out a map in which he threatened Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. And on this map, he completely erased Palestine. His map shows the occupied West Bank and Gaza as part of so-called Israel, making it clear that he wants to simply ethnically cleanse, expel all Palestinians, and now he's invading Lebanon as well and trying to colonize the southern part of Lebanon. A top Israeli cabinet member, the Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Amichai Chikli, said very clearly in a tweet that Israel does not recognize the sovereignty of Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria. So he said they're fake countries. So Israel wants to colonize their land. He cited the 100-year-old colonialist Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which the British and French empires carved up the region. So making it very clear that Israel is following the same colonial path as the European colonial powers. And he said that Israel must redraw the borders of Lebanon and colonize the southern part of Lebanon, which is exactly what Israel tried to do when it invaded Lebanon in 1982 and maintained a military occupation of Lebanon until 2000, trying to colonize the southern part of Lebanon, which is why Hezbollah exists in the first place. It was created as part of the Lebanese resistance against Israel's illegal invasion and occupation. And Hezbollah successfully expelled Israel in 2000, although Israel has continued attacking again and again, invading Lebanon again in 2006, and now invading Lebanon once more in 2024 as part of this attempt to colonize Lebanon. And then another Israeli cabinet member, the far-right finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, he also admitted that Israel has colonial goals that are completely unrealistic. They're never going to happen. So he's essentially saying that Israel is going to constantly wage war against his neighbors. He said that Israel's goal is, first of all, regime change in Iran. He said, we will continue waging war until we topple the regime in Iran. So, I mean, this is incredible. Israel is openly calling for overthrowing the Iranian government. And then he also said that Israel will keep waging war until there is no Hamas in Gaza. Hamas is a political party and also an armed movement, but it's a political party that governs Gaza. There was an election in Gaza, they won. They're the government of Gaza. So he's saying that Israel will keep waging war on Hamas until it no longer exists, which is never going to happen. I mean, they're the government of Gaza, and the more that Israel kills family members of Hamas fighters, the more that they recruit future fighters. This is never going to end until they eliminate every single Palestinian, which we know is what some of these far-right fascist extremists in Israel want. And then he also says, this is the real goal. He says that Israel's goal is to resume settlement in the Gaza Strip to have permanent Israeli colonies. So to colonize Gaza, just like Israel has colonized the occupied Palestinian West Bank, carving it up and creating more and more little colonies, which you can say is the Lebensraum. I mean, this is the same kind of fascist ideology that is motivating Israel to colonize all of the land of indigenous Palestinians. And then he also says to drive Hezbollah away, which again, Hezbollah is a political party in Lebanon. It is not only an armed movement. There's a political party called Hezbollah that has a dozen members of parliament in Lebanon's democratically elected legislature. And Hezbollah only exists because of Israel's illegal occupation and invasion and occupation of Lebanon in the 1980s. So the more that Israel brutally bombs Lebanon and kills civilians and women and children, the more it's actually recruiting future fighters for Hezbollah. And Israel absurdly claims that it's acting in self-defense, but in the past year of cross-border attacks between Israel and Lebanon, Israel was responsible for the vast, vast majority of attacks. Over 3/4 of the attacks were carried out by Israel against Lebanon. But what's so incredibly cynical about all of this is that the US government, the Biden Harris administration, is sending billions of dollars of support to Israel and strongly supporting it as it's bombing civilian areas, densely populated cities in Lebanon. But then Kamala Harris goes on Twitter and says, "We support the people of Lebanon. We're sending them $157 million in humanitarian assistance for food, shelter, water, protection, and sanitation," after the US sent Israel billions of dollars of bombs to destroy the food, shelter, water, protection, and sanitation of people in Lebanon. They wouldn't need humanitarian aid if the Biden-Harris administration were not sending Israel all of the bombs it's using to bomb them in Lebanon with US support, and then protecting Israel at the United Nations Security Council, vetoing any resolution that calls for peace or a ceasefire. In fact, while Israel has killed thousands of people in Lebanon, many civilians, many women and children, while Israel is doing that, the US is actively sending Israel more and more bombs and missiles and ammunition. And the news outlet Politico reported that top officials in the Biden-Harris administration encouraged Israel to invade Lebanon. Not only are they supporting it, they told Netanyahu, "Do it. You have our support. We give you the green light. Invade Lebanon." And throughout this time, Israel has also been carrying out attacks on Iran. And in April, Israel bombed Iran's consulate in Syria, which was an act of war against Iran on Iranian territory. And then in July, Israel carried out an attack inside the Iranian capital, Tehran, assassinating the Hamas leader, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran, an act of war against Iran. And then in September, Israel assassinated a top Iranian general in the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And in response, Iran carried out an act of self-defense, a response to Israel, launching around 180 missiles at Israel. And Kamala Harris, who's now running for president, was asked about this in an interview. She erased all of that context of Israel repeatedly attacking Iran in Iranian territory. And instead, she said, Israel must defend itself. And she said, we will always defend Israel against Iran.
The aid that we have given Israel allowed Israel to defend itself against 200 ballistic missiles that were just meant to attack the Israelis and the people of Israel. And when we think about the threat that Hamas, Hezbollah presents, Iran, I think that it is without any question our imperative to do what we can to allow Israel to defend itself against those kinds of attacks.
Now, what's also hilarious about this is in the same interview, Kamala Harris was asked why Israel's far-right Prime Minister Netanyahu has refused to bring about peace or a ceasefire, despite the Biden administration claiming that supposedly it wants one. In reality, the Biden-Harris administration has not done anything to actually push for peace and a ceasefire. They have encouraged Israel to keep expanding these colonial wars with U.S. weapons and U.S. support, sending more and more troops, thousands more U.S. troops to the region to support Israel. So in response, Kamala Harris showed how she's the expert in saying a lot of words that mean absolutely nothing. Listen to this incredible clip of Kamala, and you can hear that she just is spouting nonsense without actually saying anything.
The work that we have done has resulted in a number of movements in that region by Israel that were very much prompted by or a result of many things, including our advocacy for what needs to happen in the region.
Now that clip is so ridiculous. I actually want to read a transcript of what Kamala Harris said here when she was asked why Netanyahu is not actually pursuing peace. She said, quote, "The work that we have done has resulted in a number of movements in that region by Israel that were very much prompted by or a result of many things, including our advocacy for what needs to happen in the region," end quote. So if you translate this gobbledygook, what you get is that she's saying that we told Israel to do things and those things happened, I guess. I mean, it's complete nonsense, and it shows how Kamala Harris is not actually interested in peace or ceasefire, just like how her boss, Joe Biden, has done everything he can to support Israel, not just as president, but for decades. Going back to the 1980s, Joe Biden has constantly said that the U.S. empire will always support Israel because Israel is an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the U.S., as former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Hague famously said. And Biden said, "We must constantly support Israel, and if Israel did not exist, we would have to create it to support our interests in the region."
Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
I've often said, Mr. President, if there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one. I've long said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
And today, Biden is encouraging Israel to launch more attacks on Iran, especially targeting Iran's oil facilities, which, by the way, is a civilian target. So the U.S. and Israel are encouraging attacks on Iranian civilian targets. But this is bipartisan. It's not just Kamala Harris and Joe Biden who strongly support Israel as it's carrying out wars of aggression against many of its neighbors. In fact, Donald Trump has even more aggressively called for Israel to attack Iran and other countries in the region. And in a presidential rally, Trump called for Israel to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities.
I listened to Biden yesterday. You know, they asked him, what do you think about Iran? Would you hit Iran? And he goes, as long as they don't hit the nuclear stuff. That's the thing you want to hit, right? I said, I think he's got that one wrong. Isn't that what you're supposed to hit? I mean, it's the biggest risk we have. Nuclear weapons, the power of nuclear weapons, the power of weaponry. You know, I rebuilt the entire military, jets, everything. I built it, including nuclear, and I hated to build the nuclear, but I got to know firsthand the power of that stuff. And I'll tell you what, we have to be totally prepared. We have to be absolutely prepared. But when they asked him that question, the answer should have been, hit the nuclear first and worry about the rest later. And that's where they should.
In fact, Donald Trump is so extremely pro-Israel that he thinks calling someone a Palestinian is an insult. In the presidential debate that was held back when Biden was still a candidate between Biden and Trump, Trump said that Israel should finish the job in Gaza, which is calling for it to finish the genocide. I mean, this is incredible genocidal rhetoric, considering that, again, Israel is being investigated by the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide and is facing accusations of crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court. Well, Trump says Israel should finish the job, and then Trump called Joe Biden a Palestinian as an insult. And look at Biden's face in response to this. You can see that he's actually insulted and disgusted by what Trump's calling him. So it shows how bipartisan this racism is toward Palestinians and this dehumanization is of Palestinians.
As far as Israel and Hamas, Israel's the one that wants to go. He said the only one who wants to keep going is Hamas. Actually, Israel is the one, and you should let him go and let him finish the job. He doesn't want to do it. He's become like a Palestinian, but they don't like him because he's a very bad Palestinian. He's a weak one.
The discourse was basically the same in the presidential debate between Trump and Kamala Harris. The candidates basically fought to see who can be more pro-Israel. And Kamala Harris said, I have always supported Israel, and I support attacking Iran and its so-called proxies, when in reality, Hamas is not an Iranian proxy. Hamas is a Palestinian group. It's gotten support from Iran, but they're completely independent. In fact, Iran and Hamas disagreed on Syria. They were on opposite sides, which obviously means that it's not a proxy. And Hezbollah, likewise, is not an Iranian proxy, in scare quotes. Hezbollah has its origins in the Lebanese indigenous resistance against Israel's illegal invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and its 2-decade-long occupation of South Lebanon. But anyway, you can hear in this debate that Kamala Harris is echoing this neoconservative rhetoric about Israel and Iran.
But the one thing I will assure you always, I will always give Israel the ability to defend itself, in particular as it relates to Iran and any threat that Iran and its proxies pose to Israel.
And then Donald Trump responds claiming that Kamala Harris supposedly hates Israel, and he says, I'm the real pro-Israel candidate. And of course, there's no distinction between them on this issue. In fact, as part of his rhetoric, Trump pointed to the fact that Kamala Harris did not attend the address that Netanyahu gave in the US Congress. But even though Harris skipped Netanyahu's speech, she held a private meeting with him in Washington. So this demonstrates the cynical PR of the Democrats. Harris wanted her supporters, who were obviously frustrated by the fact that the Biden-Harris administration is supporting a far-right Israeli regime as it carries out genocide. So she tells her supporters, hey, I'm not going to attend Netanyahu's speech. But then she privately meets with Netanyahu and reassures complete U.S. support for Israel as it commits genocide. So it shows that there is no real difference between the Republicans and Democrats on this issue of support for Israeli colonialism and genocide. The only so-called differences are cosmetic. They're public relations. They're marketing. Keep that in mind while you listen to Trump here.
She hates Israel. She wouldn't even meet with Netanyahu when he went to Congress to make a very important speech. She refused to be there because she was at a sorority party of hers. She wanted to go to the sorority party. She hates Israel. If she's president, I believe that Israel will not exist within 2 years from now. And I've been pretty good at predictions, and I hope I'm wrong about that one.
Vice President Harris, he says you hate Israel.
That's absolutely not true. I have my entire career and life supported Israel and the Israeli people. He knows that. He's trying to, again, divide and distract from the reality.
What's so funny about Donald Trump's rhetoric on Israel is he claims that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden supposedly are anti-Israel, when in reality, the Biden-Harris administration has given more than $18 billion to Israel as it's carried out genocide in Gaza, invaded Lebanon, and attacked Syria, Yemen, and Iran, strongly supporting these colonial wars of aggression. And yet Trump claims they're supposedly anti-Israel. And in a speech that Trump gave at the Israeli-American Council, he had some of the most extreme pro-Israel rhetoric that you can imagine. I mean, it was incredible. And in this speech, Trump claimed that if Kamala Harris wins the election, Israel will cease to exist.
If these are positions Kamala Harris takes before the election, just wait to see what she would do after the election. You won't have a country left. Israel will not exist within 2 years if she becomes president. And what a difference a president makes. Big difference. Just 4 years ago, when I left office, the United States and Israel were safer, closer, and stronger than they have ever been before, by far.
Then Trump claimed that Kamala Harris is the candidate of the forces who want to destroy Western civilization, whereas he will defend Western civilization.
Kamala Harris is the candidate of the forces that want to destroy Western civilization. I'm the candidate of those who want to defend Western civilization, defend Israel.
In this same speech, Donald Trump threatened to deport people from the U.S. if they oppose the U.S. and Israel and its genocidal crimes, to deport them, to expel them from the country.
And we will deport the foreign jihad sympathizers and Hamas supporters from our midst. We will get them out. If you hate America, if you want to eliminate Israel, we will throw you out of our country so rapidly your head will spin.
And then, showing how extreme he is, Donald Trump boasted that he withdrew the United States from the UN Human Rights Council over its criticisms of Israel's crimes, and he also attacked the International Criminal Court, calling them radicals, the ICC at The Hague. This is how insane Donald Trump and the far-right Republicans are.
I withdrew from the anti-Semitic UN Human Rights Council, which was a big thing. I sanctioned the anti-American and anti-Israel radicals of the International Criminal Court. Many of you know what that meant. That was a big deal.
In this speech at the Israeli-American Council, Donald Trump boasted that he was, quote, the best friend Israel ever had, end quote. He bragged that he recognized Israel's illegal occupation of the Golan Heights, which according to international law is Syrian sovereign territory. And then Israel awarded him by creating an illegal settlement that's named after him called Trump Heights. He also boasted of pressuring some of the Persian Gulf monarchies, especially the UAE and Bahrain, to normalize relations with Israel in the so-called Abraham Accords. And he boasted of opening the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem in violation of international law. According to international law, East Jerusalem must be the capital of a future Palestinian state, and East Jerusalem is illegally occupied by Israel. Trump ignored that, and he instead moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. And then he also boasted of destroying the Iran nuclear deal, and he boasted of giving billions of dollars of weapons and support to Israel.
I gave them Golan Heights. I gave them the Abraham Accords. I recognized the capital of Israel and opened the embassy in Jerusalem. And most importantly of all, I terminated the Iran nuclear deal, which was the worst deal ever made in the history of Israel, in the history of the Middle East. I was there 4 years, gave them billions and billions of dollars. I was the best friend Israel ever had.
So from these clips, you can see very clearly that in the presidential election, when it comes to Israel, there is no difference between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. They both strongly support Israel as it's carrying out genocide in Gaza, bombing Gaza and the West Bank, invading Lebanon, bombing civilian areas, densely populated cities in Lebanon, as it's bombing Syria, as it's bombing Yemen, as it's constantly attacking Iran and assassinating Iranian officials. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump support these policies, and they have sent billions of dollars when Trump was president, and as vice president now, Kamala Harris, their administrations sent billions of dollars of weapons and military support to Israel to facilitate these crimes against humanity. And their running mates, the vice presidential candidates J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, also strongly support Israel, as they made very clear in the vice presidential debate. Now, what was incredible about this debate is the first question asked by CBS News was about Iran's counterstrike on Israel. They erased all of the historical context. CBS did not mention that Israel has repeatedly attacked Iran and that Iran was acting in self-defense. Instead, they portrayed Iran as an evil, aggressive boogeyman. And what was incredible about this question is they asked if the candidates would support a preemptive Israeli strike on Iran. That's the way they framed it, even though, again, Israel has already attacked Iran multiple times. And both Tim Walz and J.D. Vance made it clear that, yes, they support Israel in all of its attacks and will continue to support Israel as it wages war on Iran and other countries in the region. This was Tim Walz's response.
Governor Walz, if you were the final voice in the Situation Room, would you support or oppose a preemptive strike by Israel on Iran.
Let's keep in mind where this started. October 7th, Hamas terrorists massacred over 1,400 Israelis and took prisoners. Israel's ability to be able to defend itself is absolutely fundamental. Getting its hostages back, fundamental, and ending the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. But the expansion of Israel and its proxies is an absolute fundamental necessity for the United States to have the steady leadership there. We will stay committed. And as the Vice President said today we will protect our forces and our allied forces, and there will be consequences.
By the way, there was a hilarious moment in that clip there. I don't know if you noticed. Tim Walz accidentally said the expansion of Israel and its proxies. Of course, he meant to say Iran. I've already talked about how it's not true that these resistance forces in the region are so-called Iranian proxies. That's very misleading propaganda. But what's so funny about this clip is it's a kind of Freudian slip. I'm going to play it again.
The expansion of Israel and its proxies is an absolute fundamental necessity for the United States to have the steady leadership there.
Now, the Republican candidate, J.D. Vance, Donald Trump's running mate, basically had the same response when he was asked if he would support an Israeli so-called preemptive strike on Iran. And he said that he would support Israel no matter what it does, that Israel is a close U.S. ally. Even if it has to commit genocide, which is what it's doing, he will always support it.
Now, you asked about a preemptive strike, Margaret, and I want to answer the question. Look, it is up to Israel what they think they need to do to keep their country safe, and we should support our allies wherever they are when they're fighting the bad guys. I think that's the right approach to take with the Israel question.
In this debate, J.D. Vance also said something very misleading, and this is a common Republican talking point that Donald Trump has also constantly repeated. He said that the Biden-Harris administration has given more than $100 billion in unfrozen assets to Iran. And you'll constantly hear Republicans say, the Democrats gave $100 billion to Iran. This is so misleading. What they're talking about is Iranian assets that were illegally frozen by the United States. Actually, going back to the Barack Obama administration, the Democrats, they illegally froze Iran's foreign assets and then used those sanctions that the Obama administration imposed illegally in violation of international law on Iran in order to force Tehran to the negotiating table for the Iran nuclear deal. Those were sanctions that violated international law because they did not have the support of the UN Security Council. They were unilateral coercive measures, according to international law, which are illegal. So as part of the Iran nuclear deal, Obama agreed to lift those illegal sanctions and provide sanctions relief. And then the U.S. allowed an estimated, we don't know the exact number, but an estimate of over $100 billion of Iranian assets to go back to Iran. The U.S. was not giving Iran money. It was unfreezing the assets that it stole from Iran. Just like how the U.S. and European countries have frozen, that is stolen, $300 billion of assets belonging to Russia. And the US and European countries stole assets belonging to Venezuela and Afghanistan. So it's not like they're giving money to these countries. In this case, they unfroze what they had stolen from Iran. But then the Republicans claim that this is an example of the Democrats supposedly helping Iran. Here's this clip of Donald Trump saying that.
Then Kamala and Joe Biden delivered over $100 billion in sanctions relief, all stuff that I held back. And I would have been very good. They would have been very happy. I wanted one thing from Iran: no nuclear weapon.
And here's this clip of J.D. Vance claiming the same thing in the vice presidential debate.
Iran, which launched this attack, has received over $100 billion in unfrozen assets thanks to the Kamala Harris administration.
But again, this anti-Iran obsession in Washington is bipartisan. It's not just the Republicans. We saw this in the debate. The Democrat, Tim Walz, also demonized Iran. And he mentioned in the Trump administration, when Iran launched attacks on U.S. troops that are illegally occupying Iraq, after Iraq's democratically elected parliament voted to expel the U.S. military occupiers and Trump refused to withdraw them. And today, the Biden-Harris administration has also refused to withdraw the U.S. troops illegally occupying Iraq. But the point is that what Tim Walz did not mention, the historical context, is that Iran launched those attacks on U.S. soldiers in Iraq after Trump murdered Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, in an act of war in January 2020. And Trump also murdered the top Iraqi military official, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Al-Muhandis and Soleimani, these top Iraqi and Iranian officials, played a key role in defeating ISIS. And then what happened? Trump killed them with the support of Israel, as always. And then Iran, as an act of self-defense, after the Trump administration carried out an act of war against it, it retaliated. But again, all of that historical context is conveniently left out by the people in this debate, whether it's the candidates or whether it's the so-called journalists at CBS News, erasing all of this context. Here's this clip of Tim Walz demonizing Iran, and he does correctly point out that Trump tore up the Iran nuclear deal, which is an important historical fact, but he doesn't mention that Trump murdered top Iraqi and Iranian officials.
You'll sometimes hear a revisionist history, but when Donald Trump was in office, it was Donald Trump who we had a coalition of nations that had boxed Iran's nuclear program in, the inability to advance it. Donald Trump pulled that program and put nothing else in its place. So Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon than they were before because of Donald Trump's fickle leadership. And when Iran shot down an American aircraft in international airspace, Donald Trump tweeted, because that's the standard diplomacy of Donald Trump. And when Iranian missiles did fall near U.S. troops and they received traumatic brain injuries, Donald Trump wrote it off as headaches.
Speaking of historical context being left out, in this vice presidential debate, J.D. Vance also said that we need to talk about the order of events. And he claimed that this all started on October 7th when Hamas attacked Israel.
Now, we talk about what the sequence of events that led us to where we are right now, and you can't ignore October the 7th, which I appreciate Governor Walz bringing up. But when did Iran and Hamas and their proxies attack Israel? It was during the administration of Kamala Harris.
However, this does not start in October 2023. This starts in 1948, when Israel was founded through the mass ethnic cleansing and the violent expulsion of the majority of indigenous Palestinians in an act of genocide that has continued since, in which Israel has tried to colonize and steal all of the land of the indigenous Palestinians, just like the United States did to indigenous nations, and Canada did, and Australia did, carrying out genocide and ethnic cleansing against indigenous nations. Of course, none of that is mentioned, yet alone the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory and Syrian territory since 1967, when Israel invaded and militarily occupied these territories. And ever since then, millions of Palestinians in the West Bank have been living under illegal Israeli military rule in brutal apartheid conditions. The people of Gaza, meanwhile, were first occupied by Israel, and then Israel, after withdrawing its colonial settlers, Israel blockaded Gaza with a medieval siege that even the conservative former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, referred to as an open-air prison in Gaza. And this isn't to mention Israel's illegal occupation of the Syrian Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory, and Israel's constant wars of aggression against its neighbors, its invasion of Lebanon, its attacks on Syria and Iraq, its attacks on Iran, its attacks on Yemen, the list goes on. That's the historical context of colonialism and US-backed wars of aggression and genocide and ethnic cleansing and racism. That's the historical context that is not mentioned. Instead, we act as though everything began on October 7th. And this is, of course, what J.D. Vance and Tim Walz and the so-called journalists at CBS News claimed in this debate. They don't want to mention any of that historical context because it makes it very clear that according to international law, Israel is the aggressor carrying out colonialism and genocide. But the final remarks that I'm going to conclude this analysis with today is the comments made by J.D. Vance, because I think they are very revealing. In this vice presidential debate, He claimed that under the Biden-Harris administration, the problem is that the rest of the world no longer fears the United States. And he said that what Trump and Vance want to do is to make people fear the United States and be afraid of stepping out of line as the bully, the oppressor of the world. Here is this very revealing clip.
We have to remember that as much as Governor Walz just accused Donald Trump of being an agent of chaos, Donald Trump actually delivered stability in the world, and he did it by establishing effective deterrence. People were afraid of stepping out of line. Donald Trump recognized that for people to fear the United States, you needed peace through strength. They needed to recognize that if they got out of line, the United States global leadership would put stability and peace back in the world.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. It really summarizes how these warmongers in Washington see the United States as a global empire that needs to make the entire world afraid of its invasions and occupations and sanctions and other forms of unconventional war. And the Republicans, like Trump and Vance, are more blatant about it. They openly say, yeah, we're bullies. We're going to kick you around. The Democrats use a rhetoric of human rights and democracy, but in reality, they're also these imperialists who are constantly waging wars around the world, invading countries. Let's not forget that it was Joe Biden and his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, Democrats, who strongly supported the illegal invasion of Iraq carried out by the Republican George Bush. It was completely bipartisan. Trump also supported the invasion of Iraq, although he later lied about it. This is completely bipartisan. And their tone is a little different. The Democrats say we should be a little less blatant. We should be the smiley face of empire, whereas the Republicans say we should be the frowny face of empire. But both parties are full of brutal, murderous imperialists who want the U.S. empire to try to maintain its control over the entire world. And Israel is a very significant outpost for the U.S. empire. It is, as the former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Hague said, an unsinkable aircraft carrier that the U.S. empire uses to try to maintain its control over this region. This is why the U.S. and Israel are at war with half of the countries in the Middle East, or in West Asia is a better term. That's why they're attacking Iraq and Iran and Syria and Yemen. And that's why Israel is invading Lebanon and carrying out genocide in Gaza. It is part of an attempt to maintain U.S. imperial control over one of the most strategic regions on Earth, which of course has very plentiful and lucrative natural resources and is located in a geostrategic location connecting Asia to Europe. These are the kinds of things that we discuss here regularly at Geopolitical Economy Report. But this analysis has already been long enough today, so I'm going to conclude on that note. I'm Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.